But I want to start with good news. Brilliant news, in fact. News I doubt you would have heard anywhere else today. Racism in Australia, you can forget it. It's not a big problem at all. I bet you didn't hear that today, because that would tell us that for half a century we've probably been on totally the wrong track in Aboriginal affairs. There are actually two things today that should make us realise this. The first and most optimistic bit was this story that migrant kids were outperforming kids born here in the NAPLAN tests. But more than that, it found that by year 9, children whose parents were from non-English speaking countries, China or India, places like that, were 3 times more likely to be getting great marks for maths, and nearly twice as likely even for English compared to children from English-speaking backgrounds. And that's incredible, right? I mean, it's good. Now, it's true that kids from migrant families like me, they could have this advantage. They have parents with get up and go. In fact, our parents did just that. They got up and went. But that doesn't explain it all. What it tells us is that culture counts. If you come from a culture that values learning, where the parents have authority, perhaps they don't divorce as much, those children are more likely to succeed. It's not rocket science. There's no magic to it. And that explains why Jewish schools do so well, for instance, and why many ethnic Chinese children do well too, many Indian ones. And of course, just look around how many adults of those groups succeed in this country as well. Look at our Foreign Minister of Chinese ancestry, our Attorney General of Jewish background, a number of our billionaires and judges too. Racism is not holding them back. Skin colour, it's not holding them back. It's not holding our Sikhs back either, for instance. So for them, culture does count. And so when we look at why so many Aborigines, not all by a long shot, but why so many Aborigines, particularly in rural areas, are doing it much tougher, I think it is lazy and a cop-out to say, well, that's just racism, that's just dispossession, that's just white people holding them back. It's lazy and it's patronising to say that what they need now is what no other race in this country has needed to get ahead. A voice. A kind of advisory parliament just for their own race, and written into our constitutions as Labor. As if the reason that too many Aborigines are poor or unemployed or don't send their kids to school is because whites don't listen. No. Culture in some communities has to play a role. It's not the whole story, but it is part of it. But it's almost unlawful now to say that, especially on TV. That's how dangerous it is now to have an honest debate. That's why so many politicians won't go there and fix one of our greatest tragedies. They'd rather keep repeating these mistakes decade after decade. But what else can you conclude from the other story today, but that culture does count? Opposition leader Peter Dutton this week met members of largely Aboriginal communities in Western Australia and heard some tough truths that Labor won't face. Now, what some in those meetings were saying was that some Aborigines, again, not all, some were getting royalties or compensation, sometimes big money, yet were still poor. And why? Well, Marty Sealander, who's head of the Kapanu Aboriginal Corporation, said, I know one lady who got $100,000 a year ago. That's a lot of money, $100,000 a year ago. And she's got nothing left now. What tends to happen, he said, is people who know someone's getting money, they get all over that person until they get a share of it. And that's a cultural thing. In some parts of the country, it's called humbugging. Others might call it, in fact, a kind of communism. Just like Aborigines with land rights, having to share ownership with the tribe. There's no individual title to land. And you've got to ask, wherever in the world has communism like that worked? Certainly not in the Soviet Union. And why would you expect it to work in outback Australia? Another person at these meetings with Dutton was Des Cannons. He runs Laverton's supermarket and is its postmaster. He said, guys from the lands, he's talking about Aborigines from outside the town, they come in, they've just got $30,000 or $40,000 in royalty payments, usually from mines, right? And they burn through it. One woman, he said, got $65,000 recently, and it was gone in 2 weeks. And why? Among other things, yes, that humbugging may be, but alcohol again. Alcohol, so tragic. And the results so ghastly. Here is someone else who was at those meetings, local Liberal MP Rick Wilson.
When I arrived in Laverton on Monday afternoon, Pat Hill, the Shire President, showed me a photograph of a woman who'd been beaten so badly that she'd been half scalped. This is at 9 o'clock on a Thursday night outside the Shire offices. The CCTV footage revealed that that woman had been beaten for about an hour and 10 minutes.
Now, but what else do you really expect in a way? I mean, we're funding welfare ghettos essentially out bush where there's almost no real work, no real incentive, not much entertainment apart from the booze, and a huge gush of sit-down money coming in, welfare, royalties, and that's without even talking about cultural issues. You tell me, what group of people of any race would do well? And that's why our whole approach now to Aboriginal disadvantage has failed and will continue to fail, whether there's a voice or not. Because it's all pitched on this idea that Aborigines are victims and whites are the villains, and what's needed are sorries and compensations and more welfare and treaties, a voice, now a truth-telling commission Labor wants, and the whole awful rest of that. And then you just look around. I mean, for heaven's sake, just look. You've got many Aborigines are in fact doing well. You don't hear enough about them. They are doing well. And they're usually people whose parents or grandparents or even great-grandparents, they made that hard call. Assimilate, modernise, grab these new opportunities, go to where there's work, send your kids to school. Now, I remember the academic who invented the phrase stolen generation, this terrible idea, dead-end idea that Aboriginal children stolen from their parents, up to 100,000 of them eventually, we were told. They were stolen from their culture, a sin. Now this guy, Peter Reid, he named just two people at first, two examples. One was Charlie Perkins, who actually became our first Aboriginal to head a federal government department. And the other was Lowicho O'Donoghue, became Director of the Department of Aboriginal Affairs South Australian Office and the country's leading Aboriginal activist. I mean, thinking of that success is not immediate to me. Victim. I mean, really. And it turns out a reason for their success. Perkins' mother had actually asked an Anglican priest to take him down from Alice Springs to Adelaide for an education. O'Donoghue's white father, this is a more tragic example, sadly abandoned her. But at least, before he did, he gave her to other Christians, to the United Aborigines Mission, Colebrook Home, to get an education. And that education turned out to be critical, that enculturation. Or you look at also, how many examples? Senator Pat Dodson, now the Albanese government's special envoy for reconciliation. Impressive man. His parents sent him down to a Catholic school in Victoria, where he became captain of the football team and also school captain before being accepted as a Catholic priest. I could give you so many other examples. Now, if you want Western results from Aboriginal communities, you need a fair bit of Western culture to get them. People don't want to hear it, but it's true. Assimilation, and not this cult of apartheid, is the key. Not at this apartheid of us and them, this endless talk of treaties and the voice and wah. And until we get that change in our politics and in our policies, even in our cultures, nothing is really going to change. But it must.